Look, the piece of work that I just wanted to talk to this committee about, as I have the Environment Committee, grew out of, actually it's got a long history. It started with a report I did on called Farms, Forests and Fossil Fuels, which was, in my view, it was analysing what would happen if we just kept on with a net approach to managing carbon emissions. And the short answer was we'd cover the country in pine trees. And so I thought that the modelling was a bit crude. And I was also aware that there were a lot of other regulatory, measures being brought to bear in the rural sector around biodiversity, around water. And so I thought, well, let's look at it in a joined up way. If you tried to meet all of these things, what would happen? And so the modelling we did was not just environmental modelling, but economic modelling. We used FarmAct. My chief economist, Geoff Simmons, is here, can answer all questions about the numbers on this. And we chose two catchments, one up in the far north, which is the northern Wairoa, which is the northern half of the Kaipara Harbour. And the other one was the Mataura, down in the deep south, Murihiku. So we chose two ends of the country. It couldn't be more different. And we worked very, very closely with local communities, with mana whenua, with farmers, with the industry people, communities, regional council, local council. And we modelled different scenarios to say what would happen. And look, we've got 40 minutes, I'll be brief. Basically, it proved in a more fine-grained sense what my earlier report said, and that is that you'd end up with a binary landscape of dairy farming and pine trees. Dairy farming, because it's profitable and it can sort of pay for the environmental measures, and pine trees because there's just this flood being driven by the ETS, cheapest way out of reducing our emissions. I could have just left it there. That's the one on the right, exploring land use change under different policy settings. And if you're interested, I'd recommend that you read it. It'll take a bit of time. And if you want to discuss it, talk to Geoff here, because models are models and it's all dependent on assumptions. You probably might want to challenge things. I thought just putting that out wouldn't be very helpful because we just have a debate about models. So I thought, what could I do which was more useful? And that was, let's try to say, what did I learn in the process of talking to all of those local people and doing the exercise? What did we learn about what could make a difference? Because I came to the view that trying to do this all from Wellington by regulation just wasn't ever going to get us there. We had to think of a different way of doing this. So what are the lessons? Matt, the first lesson is that in this country, anyhow, land use change is the norm. It's happening all the time. It's either driven by regulation, as in the case of the ETS, or it's driven by the marketplace. And that's just between 1996 and 2018. And I think it's really revealing. You know, it's amazing the amount of land which has changed its use. The big two trends are grassland going to exotic forestry and forestry going to grassland. The forestry going to grassland is up around Wairake, in the middle of North Island, all into dairying, you know, but you know about the hill country being taken over by a carbon forest. So, you know, that is the norm in New Zealand. If you did this diagram back over decades and decades, it would be moving around all the time. So there's nothing unusual about land use change. The question is, are we getting the best land use change from both an economic and an environmental viewpoint? Next slide asks, Matt, I could do this quicker than you. Can we get the, thank you. Next thing is that if we want to meet the environmental bottom lines, which have been erected to date, then the way we use land needs to change. In some cases, management change, known management change techniques can get us there, but there are roughly a third of catchments in New Zealand somewhere where they can't meet on any known land use regime the bottom lines for nitrogen or for sediment or for phosphorus. And in 1.5% of catchments, in the middle of that Venn diagram there, you can't reach any of them. And we didn't put E. coli in there because we weren't very confident in the numbers. And it's so dependent on rain events and so on. So anyhow, that's what we've got. You'll see that probably the most challenged catchment in New Zealand is Horizons, the Manawatu.
Okay.
And I'm going up there next year, early next year, to spend a couple of days just to try to dig into that myself. This is not my work, by the way. This came out of the Our Land and Water climate change. So this is the most recent piece of science that's been done in New Zealand at the national level to try to pull this together. So, I mean, you're confronting land use change if you want to meet environmental goals. Next slide. Climate is also going to force land use change on us. I've just got two photos here because they tell two sides of a story. This is the photo you use when you wanted to say that forestry is the problem, and forestry and climate change won't go together. And then the next slide is the one you show when you want to show that farming is the problem. The reality is it's the same landscape. It's up the East Coast, and there's a lot of country where we will be able to do neither. These rain events are not going to stop, and they are going to take it out on the land, which we have seriously, we've made fragile through the way that we're using it. So, what are the big learnings we came to? The most important one for me is that just trying to regulate environmental outcomes on a property basis is seriously limited. I just don't think we can get there doing that. It's so difficult not having these slides. No, okay, yeah. The problem is that you have to deal with the level of the catchment. The water didn't know that there were property boundaries. I mean, nature didn't know. That's the way the land is. What we've done is covered it with all of these boundaries, and saying to individual landowners, you've got to take responsibility for X or Y to meet Z or H doesn't make a lot of sense. You've got to say, where in that landscape can we make the most progress? And when we did the work in both Matara and in Wairoa, we used some work called physiographics, which tries to layer information about the natural world to draw a picture of where the hotspots are. And this is something which the Southland Regional Council and Clint Risman have done a lot of work. And I just want to show you the layers for E. coli susceptibility. So this is in some parts of New Zealand you can do this. You can't do this everywhere, but this is how you layer it. So you've got your boundaries of people's land, then you've got elevation, then you've got slope, then you've got terrain roughness, you've got rainfall. So, and by the way, this is in the Wairoa. This is in the middle of, just at the bottom of the blue bit there is the Hikarangi swamp. Okay, the Hikarangi repo, which is a drained piece of land, huge amount of public subsidy has gone into it, and farmers are having to fork out to keep it, and it's being overwhelmed by rain events. But that's the strains down off this picture to the Kaipara Harbour. Next one, soil pH, obviously, and then there is the underlying geology, which is measured through radiometrics. This is a potassium radioactive decay map. And then finally, put all that together, and you can say that E. coli is going to be most apparent in those dark red places. Now, just to put the property boundaries back on it, and then let's just zoom into that bit so you can see it more clearly. You can see that managing the land around boundaries is, I mean, if you wanted to match the land and the contribution and everything to the problem, it would be a mind-bending task. And the solutions won't lie within any one particular property, which is the reason that we need, I think, to step back and get another level for dealing with the problem. So, this is bizarre. Yes, the select committee system really needs state of the art. So, what could make a difference? Well, the first thing I recommend is bringing decision-making closer to the people having to make changes. One of the things that came through very clearly in Southland is that there's a very well-developed catchment groups. The entire Matara catchment, there's 26 catchment groups, and they have a sort of a collective body which links them all together. And you've got a very, very direct link with the community on the ground. And you can link that with mana whenua, you can link that with the local communities, the businesses and all the rest of it. So if you've got some environmental limits you want to meet, it's quite a good group to say, okay, how are you going to meet these limits? You've got to make the trade-offs. And they wouldn't make them, I'm almost certain, on the same basis, property by property. You choose the hotspots. Now, that's not enough in itself because it takes resources and it takes information. So the second point is, if you wanted to make a system like that work, you have to have, I say cheap, I think it should be free access to high quality environmental information. I think this is a fundamental role of government, it's a fundamental public good. A lot of it is there. Those layers I showed you are drawn from NIWA and land care and other bits and pieces. But we do not have a data architecture for the environment that can be pulled together in this country. And it is crying out for it. We've got to do something to not just fill gaps, but also to integrate the information that's there. And I should tell you, regional councils are sitting on a huge amount of information, but it's all confidential. It's commercial. And there's no trust in the current regulatory system. So farmers don't want to share what they've got. Now, I think it's a two-way street. If there's going to be free information, publicly funded information on all of those layers, then landowners have to make their information on the way they're using the land and what they're putting on and the rest of it. We've got to pull this all together in a picture so that you can then say, okay, where are we going to make progress and how? And then the how comes to money. Who's going to pay? Now, obviously, landowners, they already are going to be having to do some paying, but I think there is a role for public subsidy here, but you wouldn't want to spend it everywhere. You wouldn't want to give everybody a little bit. And I worry that we've spent huge amounts of money trying to fence every drain and do all of this. But in fact, there were some places where it needed much more action and spending the money there would have made a whole lot more sense. So and this is the work we did, we tried to be explicit about the economic cost of this because someone's going to have to pay. The most expensive single publicly funded case in New Zealand was Lake Taupō, $80 million, ratepayers and taxpayers' money. And we reduced the nitrogen intake by 20%. And the regulation which follows will stop land use change to more intensive uses. Now, it cost 80 million. And as I say in my report, that was fine because there was a large constituency for doing it who weren't resident there at all. They had batches and they live in Auckland and Wellington and elsewhere. So very easy to persuade the public to spend the 80 million there, much harder over the rest of New Zealand. The report also goes into the funding programs that Parliament has been funding in recent years. That was the case up until a year ago. And, you know, you'd have to say if you were going to put public money into trying to help land use change for environmental improvement, would you, hang on, you've gone forward, would you spend it on so many programs and in that particular way? That's what was there. And the last budget has cut a lot of that. So it now looks like this as far as we can see. And all I can say is that if you wanted to get behind a bottom-up approach to doing this, you'd have to provide some funding. I mean, just there's back office stuff to enable community-based groups to work. You've got no money. There's now no money left. There's nothing is uncommitted. So we're stuck with whatever. So Southland got through the gate and they've got good resource and backup. Not also locally funded, and AgMart's put money in, but I think you would need to look at public programs if you wanted to go further on that. So, next slide. So what can make a difference? You've heard me on the first three. The fourth one I won't even spend the time on. You've heard me say it a number of times in different reports. I don't believe we should be running forestry as a solution for fossil emissions. They should come out of the ETS for the future. The government says it's going to have a price on methane. Previous government was going to do the same thing. I think an ETS is a good way to do that. But unlike the fossil world, I think that tree planting, offsetting, is a legitimate offset for methane. And it surprises me that farmers who are upset about forestry covering the landscape haven't actually focused in on what's causing it. And that's an ETS, which is not making fossil polluters pay. So what's happening is that the fossil polluters are dumping their pollution on the landscape, which is removing that option for farmers if they wanted to offset their emissions. And I think there's a big change needed there. Final point, and I'll shut up, Mr. Chairman. I think that if you're going to move forward in the space, we don't need yet another grand top-down, we're going to solve this with one regulatory code or whatever approach. We're too good at doing that in this country. I think that we need to prioritise and we need to experiment. I showed you the map with the hotspots. I think that if the government wanted to do something differently, if it wanted to use catchment groups, I think that the thing would be to choose some of those difficult catchments and trial a different way of doing this. One size does not fit all. And before we have another grand scheme for running stuff, let's see what we could learn by doing something differently. So that's my final slide, is it? Yes. So there we are. So questions, please.
Thank you, Councillor, very much for your time. Go straight to Steve Abel, then Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an excellent piece of work and, very illustrative of how, when you talk about the catchment, not just the property. As to your point on the need for readily available information that, in principle, you're saying should be provided by the government, or that should be a public good.
Yeah.
Is there a challenge with the inability to identify where we should be investing, i.e., those priority hotspots, because we've stopped looking? I mean, the big example recently is the no longer identify significant natural areas. Is there equivalent in this space where we risk losing the ability to actually identify where we want to focus to deal with big problems? That's kind of the first question. The second one is, what does the landscape look like if it's not just pine trees and dairy farms? Is it a mosaic landscape? What do we actually what does land use change look like in an ideal sort of environmental setting? And without being prescriptive, I understand we don't want to be prescriptive, but obviously we probably all agree we don't want just pine trees and dairy farms. And the third question is, it's to your ETS problem, is that have we not tricked ourselves that we can offset emissions in general, and that applies not just to carbon, but I think to methane as well, when actually we need to be talking about gross cuts in emissions. We need to be talking about real zero rather than net zero.
Rather than selling a right to pollute.
Steve, let me just take it because I can remember the last one most easily. You help me go backwards. Look, absolutely right. I mean, we have, and let me say, as I've said to others, if you want to find a guilty man, it's me. I'm the person in the 1990s who argued internationally that a net approach was the right way to go. And we took it, the science said, look, a molecule of carbon dioxide captured in a tree is no different from one that's not emitted to the atmosphere. So this is all the same. And of course, what we've come to realise is that these are very different. It's a very different equation, that you're putting stuff into the atmosphere effectively permanently for thousands of years. You've got no way of guaranteeing a tree is going to stay there for thousands of years. But when you plant it, you have to say it's there in perpetuity, and you've lost the option value. It's there for good. So we're tying up land in one way, and we don't know how we're going to actually be able to make it stay there. So I think it's time to admit that is not the answer. You need to reduce gross emissions. And I'm pretty confident that if you took forestry out of the ETS for the future, and I'm not talking about disrupting anybody's rights. People have invested on the basis that it was legit, so protect all of that. But for the future, you would see a rising carbon price. And then auctions would no longer fail, and the government actually would get some real revenue. And then you've got the revenue to tackle some of these land use problems. Now, I understand there's a debate about not hypothecating money from taxes, but there would be a way to, for instance, answer the concerns of Māori in parts of New Zealand who say, listen, we've got marginal land. The only income we can earn is from carbon. And so, okay, well, we can provide land use change options for you. It doesn't have, but it'll be funded by the fossil polluters. It doesn't have to be through the carbon market. And so your second question, I think, was what does the ideal landscape look like? I don't know, and we don't live in the world of ideals, but I think it would be certainly more of a mosaic than it will be under the current regime. The current regime is just massively distorted by the ETS. You are seeing land use change on a scale you would not see without that. So then other options become possible. Do you want to say something about options?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to look very different. We've been going around the country talking to different regions, and the issues are just so different in different regions. Particularly, you know, the availability of water will be a big driver of what land use, what land use change is possible.
Yeah.
And you know, there's all sorts of issues around that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, just have a look at the case studies, because you'll see that the Northland scenarios were quite different from the Southland ones. Southland, they dropped in tulips, which I can tell you there's some problems with as well. But up in the north, they were trying to choose a tree crop, and we looked at avocados, huge water demand. So macadamias, not so much. So it was a more compatible one, and you know, in theory, looks very profitable. Of course, the issue is, okay, fine, great idea, but there needs to be skill, there needs to be a market, there needs to be processing. So the whole value chain doesn't exist. So it's very easy to model theoretical alternatives, but the world doesn't work like that. So now the first question, which I've now totally lost track of, was
environmental information.
and what was the point there? Because
Well, so like, if we're going to target the hotspot areas rather than go property by property, we're going to say, what are the challenges we really want to fix? If we want to protect this
you need the
water
information
catchment,
for that space.
we
Yes.
need the
Yeah.
information. And is the move away from things like identifying significant natural areas a problem for that?
Well, any gap is a problem. And look, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the biodiversity on which the SNAs are built, or whether you're talking about sediment or nutrient or anything. If you don't have information, then you end up making it up. Now, you can make up a certain amount using modelling to try to fill gaps, but there are parts of New Zealand where we simply don't have good enough information. I can't tell you, because I haven't done this work, where the hotspot catchments, where they map onto the thickness or not of data. The reason we chose Matara is because the regional council had spent a lot of money on the data, and so there's a really good information base there. There wasn't, and there was in Northland as well, actually, different, but there's other parts of New Zealand where we don't have that. I mean, you still haven't got LiDAR over all of rural New Zealand. So you've got to have a plan to fill the gaps, but I would say fill the gaps in the most important places first. One other quick thing, next year I'll be bringing you a report on how we could mobilize new technologies, new information technologies, to bridge some of these gaps and to speed things up. Because to be frank with you, if we tried to collect the data on, say, you know, that NIWA or Landcare have been collecting the way we've been collecting it in the past, it'd be a very expensive thing, or regional councils. There are techniques emerging now, not just emerging, they're there. If we use them, we could collect a hell of a lot more, and most importantly, integrate it. And you see, what you saw with those layers is the integration of data. That is what we are not set up to do. And that's because we run a system where data collection has been devolved to regional councils, who to some extent are having to make it up as they go along for themselves. In the days of the old National Water and Soil Conservation Authority, they probably wasn't such good data, but it was actually a centralised system. I have advocated for some time that this issue of collection of data and integration of data is something that should be led from the centre. It's what a proper environmental protection authority would be doing. So, you know, you've got an issue about information and how you integrate it, which I think Parliament will need to address.
There's certainly a much greater role that both central government and regional government can do in collecting that data, and a case for investment in more. But if we only look at this as a top-down government supplying this information as a public good, we're never going to get the granularity that you need to properly manage things at a catchment or a community level. There's also a wealth of data that's held either in regional councils that is confidential through consent management, but on farms themselves and landowners and others. And that also needs to come into the system as well. I mean, one of the call for provision of cheap, free information is actually a two-way street.
Yeah.
If you want to use that, there needs to be a bit of a quid pro quo of putting it back into that system. Now, there is a real trust issue out
I was
there
just going
of
to say, you're never
landowners
going to
providing
get
that
that. I would
information.
never hand my information.
Massive
rather
trust
than
issue
second
because
party.
we've got mortgages that
Why would
Well,
you?
that's
We've got to make
that's a
good with.
strong thing to say they're completely incompetent. Okay, all right. I mean,
Let me
okay.
count the votes.
Okay, no, but you're,
Count the
but,
ways.
but you're absolutely right. We're aware of this from the work we've done. There is a complete lack of confidence and trust. May I just say that in my own case, actually, I wanted to look at the data layers for my property, and I found that they were just incredibly thin. I did the opposite of what you would do. I went along and said, look, I'd like to give you all this information because I've got wet bits
Oh, no,
here,
we've done the
things-
same,
Yeah.
but they've asked for independent reports
Yeah,
that they're.
no, well, I
completely-
didn't do that. I said, look, I'm happy for you
No,
to
they
know this.
collect
Here's a
data.
map, this is the
Okay,
stuff, yeah.
Tim.
But I mean, but we need a regulatory world where people are happy to share the data because they're confident that it will be used in the right way. And they're confident that they're not having a debate about this is my data versus your data. Now, my feeling is if you can solve the data problem and then use community level catchment groups to use that data to make decisions, you might cure the trust problem and you also might make some progress.
I
And we
understand
We
what
have a
you're saying.
supplementary, Suze, because
Yeah.
there we,
Yeah.
It is, but I understand what you're saying
Yeah.
and the lack of data architecture. But so are you saying, you're talking about a sort of single source of truth, obviously, but then is it going to be managed by one entity or is it going to be, or collated by one entity?
I think, look, if you want standardization and you want comprehensiveness and you want openness, then it needs to be in public
Yeah,
ownership.
I agree.
Okay? And I think that is ultimately the EPA. I mean, again, I haven't made detailed recommendations on this, but one thing you could consider is saying, okay, the data, the monitoring and state of the environment stuff, which is done by regional councils, same people, same community people, but they are part of the EPA. You make that part of a national network. So that way you can leverage all of the skills and you can reduce the cost of doing stuff.
Just on the privacy and trust side of things, we do have a precedent with the integrated data infrastructure, which is on the social side. You know, Bill English set that up in the around 2010, and it brings together all the administrative data on the social side, allows for the whole social investment approach. Now, this would have to be a bit different because we're talking about a more federated system, but the same principles apply of being able to manage individual privacy, but allowing big data to allow you to identify where the issues are.
Catherine,
I just had.
It's a good analogy.
One more thing.
well, please be succinct because we are.
Very quick, like you said, you went everywhere to find to when you were doing your research. So who did you talk to when you were on the ground? Like you talked to the regional councils, obviously. Who else did you?
You know,
talk to?
well, most importantly, we talked to landowners and the catchment groups.
Cool.
We talked to Māori in these areas because they've got a very strong interest in water and issues. We talked to local businesses. You know, I mean, we talked to everybody we could talk to, if you know what I
Awesome.
mean.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was to ground truth. So we weren't just inventing something. We actually asked them to help us validate the scenarios we were running.
And we've shared with you a note of some of the post-launch engagement that we've done with communities in different regions that unearth some additional issues.
Interesting about it, Corinne. Catherine.
Look, thank you very much for your presentation. I am the MP for Hawke's Bay, and obviously land use management was a big focus for us during the aftermath of Cyclone Gabrielle, given the slash and the damage that came through from the forestry up in the hills. But that is not what I wanted to touch on with you today. I wanted to actually talk to water because it's been raised across the Hiratonga Plains at the moment. Allocations have been halved. You know, we can't grow even what we need to right now in Hawke's Bay, let alone kind of grow anymore or diversify the land, essentially. We're one of the only regions in New Zealand that doesn't have a large-scale water storage project that can actually give water security, but improve water catchments. And I think you spoke about funding, and, you know, having funding from the government, but obviously there's also regulatory settings and legislation that we can create to enable things as well. How important do you feel that the legislative framework around water and the focus on water is?
That has not been part of this piece of work.
Yeah, but-
I haven't delved into that in detail. All we observe is that water is going to be one of the major constraints to land use change.
Yes.
So if you wanted to change from uses which were more polluting to ones which were less polluting, or you could manage differently, if you need water to do it, that is going to be a constraint. Now, how you go about finding that water and managing it, that's an environmental regulation issue. And, you know, there are trade-offs here. You've got to satisfy the community that it's worth the trade-off. But this has not been the subject of our work. Did you want to add anything?
Well, we did mention in the report
You
the
spoke
issue
about
of
it, and
Māori
it's-
rights
yes.
and Māori rights and interests needing to be
Yeah.
resolved for you to be able to set up a
Sorry,
rational,
yes, indeed. Yeah, we did.
rational system of water allocation.
I mean, yeah, we say that, you know, if there was water trading, if you decide, okay, there's this amount of water available and you want flexible use, if you can't change uses, if somebody's got a right for 35 years and that's it, and you know, you can't get at it. But of course, if you wanted to have a market in water, then you're going to have to satisfy some Article 2 issues, and that needs a big, brave conversation. I mean, the Land and Water Forum was saying this almost 10 years ago now. It's been identified as a key issue that we need to address as a country. But it's a somewhat different issue from what I was focused on.
Yeah, okay, so then just another quick question
succinctly.
of, yes, because you put up the graphs and you showed the different funding streams, and I think, you know, from programs that we're investing in, it's not necessarily about how many, but the value that you're getting out of those programs. What is your view on
Yeah.
that?
Oh, well, that I don't know, and you don't know, because one of the problems is that we have a system of public expenditure where you create all of these funds. There's no evaluation, no ex-post evaluation. I mean, there's been a bit, but one of my criticisms.
Previously, there hasn't been, but obviously looking forward, we're
Well,
obviously wanting to look at
yes.
getting
Yeah.
value out of
That's
the
right.
money that we
So,
spend.
yes, indeed. And so first of all, you need to know why you're spending it.
Yes,
So you need to link that expenditure to an outcome.
yes,
That you're trying to achieve. The Public Finance Act, the way it's currently structured, doesn't enable you to do that. If you were on the Environment Select Committee, you would be in a week or two receiving my 4th edition.
They've got it as well.
Oh, you've got it as well. It's okay. So you've seen this. I produce an estimate of expenditures related to outcomes. That should be your portal as a select committee to ask some questions and to say, right, if it's water quality you're trying to improve, we want to see these agencies who we note are contributing to that outcome. Tell us how those programs fit together or don't fit together. What is the value for money? Currently, we don't know what it is. And I'm on a real warpath on the public expenditure side. So with your support and the Environment Committee support, we might get some answers to these questions.
okay, great.
Can I recommend you get the newly formed National Catchment Collective to come in and talk to you about this, because they've been looking at quite in depth at the previous spending in this area and trying to learn lessons about how you might set up a funding system in the future. We can put you in touch with them if you.
Okay.
They
thank
came
you.
to Parliament a couple of months back.
Yeah.
Okay, well, they're doing work on this right now.
So that would be really good, because
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
that's where we, obviously, if we're spending money and you put the graph up
Yeah.
in the programs, but
Yeah.
you know, what are the outcomes?
Exactly.
And what's the value of that?
Yes, exactly.
We could just go to a couple of other questions very quickly.
Sure.
If you'd be obliging, we're almost out of time. Cognizant of the societal effects of land use change, it's all very well for farmers to feel like they're being forced into adapting when sort of it's the market signals that make those investment decisions for them and the mortgages that they hold. How do you reconcile that? Because I think we all agree we want to improve environmental outcomes. We're all here for the same reason, and certainly you are. As farmers, we make decisions based on causality. If we invest in something, you know, and there isn't a perceived outcome that's beneficial to our business model, we're not going to do it. See in one of your remarks about, you know, potential, especially in the Canterbury catchment, methodologies that could be used by farmers. And this is just one silly example you gave, or good example. depending on how you frame it, that farmers would choose to winter graze off. Now, in the practical world, I'm sorry, because I'm very practical, that's $25 per head per month. Now, there's a societal impact on that. I own a mortgage.
Should be 35.
Well, yeah, depend on where you're going.
Yeah, exactly.
Has that been built into, we all want change, right? We want to improve, but in the practical world, when you've got a couple of $1 million hold off mortgage over you,
Sure.
you can't make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, on that,
Can't.
those examples were given to
Can't
us
be green
by
when you're in the red.
farmers.
They do want to down.
Those examples were given to us by farmers who said the regulations mean we can't take the best decision. We're actually prevented from doing what would be a better environmental outcome.
Assuming that they
it's a-
could afford that scenario.
Yes, indeed.
It's
but
a side effect of trying to manage things on a property level
Yeah.
and getting regulations down to a top-down
Yeah.
regulations down to a
Yeah.
property level. You end up with all these perverse outcomes because it
Totally.
removes flexibility.
But look, but to go back to your bigger point, and that is, I mean, my job is if you look at my act, I'm here to actually help you ask about how effectively the environmental management system we have is with a view to improving the environment. So you're not going to have the Environment Commissioner coming along and say, well, look, folks, we could just let the environment slip a bit further and, we'd be hunky-dory. That's not my job. So from my point of view, we need to improve environmental quality. It's gone down a long way. If you think things have got too environmental, then you have to explain how much further you would let it go before you did something. But anyhow, that we need to achieve outcomes. We need to achieve them at least cost. Now, that modelling, the reason why dairying goes on is it's profitable enough to actually pay for cleanup. We can't live in a world where people say, oh, well, I don't think, a world we say, okay, well, look, I'd really like to help, but I'm sorry, I can't afford to, so we'll just let the environment go a bit further. That's not going to be a sustainable answer long run. So the question is, and it's particularly a problem for the beef and sheep sector, there's a very, very narrow profitability.
Bandwidth,
Yeah, exactly. So how are you going to help them make changes? Now, not for reasons I support, of course, the ETS is making wholesale changes there and people are exiting, I don't think that's a good idea. But it is one exit option. Now, if you had a price on methane and if you could offset the methane with trees and you weren't having to compete with urban polluters, then there's a market for tree planting on marginal land, which would be driven within the agricultural sector, actually. Because I would suspect the dairy sector would actually find that was, to some extent, a reasonably economic way of offsetting.
Want to do a quick sup on that?
I've got a sub, what was your, yes.
40
Who had a
minutes
sub
of
over here? Was you,
fun and
Sue? Was it just you into what we were asking and then you can go to Steve?
Oh, I was just talking about the issue and how you manage in some regions, the water's actually coming off a natural resource like a mountain in Rangitikei.
Yeah.
And it's already not meeting the standards, the environmental
Well,
standards, before it's passed
sure.
through any productive land.
So you start from where we are, not from some ideal place that doesn't exist. I mean,
Yeah.
all
So
of
it's
that,
impossible.
it's all of that has got to be part of a sensible equation.
And I think that's where you need a little bit of flexibility in your regulatory system
Yeah.
to be able to go, okay, in this situation, this is
Which is
what-
why writing regulations from the centre on a one-size-fits-all basis simply can't work.
But in a lot of catchments, we don't even have the monitoring to a decent level to be able to tell you that sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
Steve, very quick.
We're quite good in our region.
So sorry,
I'm
Sue.
just concerned
You
that
said they were on.
Yes.
Oh, they are.
what I don't understand is if you switch the incentive
Catchment,
to
forgot about
planting
that.
forestry from CO2 to biogenic methane, aren't you, and the dairy industry has an ability to offset its emissions through forestry, aren't you just going to keep the same pattern of taking out sheep and beef and
Well-
favouring dairy and getting more pine trees? I don't see how that's going to stop that transition.
The first point is that it would at least not tie up the option value forever, because the point of offsetting for methane is that if you reduce your emissions, you can also reduce the amount of trees. It's happening within the same time frame. So that's for me, the big advantage of that sort of offsetting is that you're not tying the land up forever, which you are with the current system that we've got. Then look, there is land which would be better in trees. And if it was pine trees planted by a dairy company to offset some of the emissions for methane, those are trees that can be harvested.
Surrender.
and they can actually be cut down if you reduce your emissions. I mean, look, the government's spending $400 million, or 340 million, I think, and industry spending the thick end of 100 million on trying to find a suite of options between feeds, vaccines, so on and so forth. If some of that comes to fruit, then that has to be used. So that's your first claim on emissions reduction. But then you might be able to go further. No one's saying zero for methane. It's a question of how far down.
But I'm just
So-
concerned you're going to get
yeah.
the same effect of Hawaii Canal is effectively dairy throwing sheep and beef under the bus through doing property-based management. And I don't see how what you're proposing will not have the same effect. It will be the dairy industry offsetting their emissions by taking out sheep and beef.
Well, it'd be everybody offsetting emissions. They would be the biggest emitter, yes.
But the marginal land is what's going to go
Yeah.
first.
Yes, and that marginal land probably is, in the worst catchment, some of that marginal
Shouldn't
land
apply, though.
will have to change, and that is going to be the best use for it, if you like.
Well, no, not necessarily. You're arguing it's all about the profitability, so therefore it's going to take over, the profitable one's going to take over the least, but yeah.
Least
Sheep-
profitable
sheep-
marginal
sheep-
cost
sheep-
land goes in.
It's
indeed,
not nothing to
indeed.
do with the
Yeah,
margin, yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Anyhow, we could spend a long time further, and I'd invite it, if you want to come over and talk to us, and talk through these studies we've done.
Love to.
There's a lot of background here.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
it's
thank you, everyone. We've kind of met time.
Yeah, sure,
Thank you.
understood.